The woman on the gurney had refused Lena Vale's touch 11 minutes earlier, dismissing her with the brittle confidence of someone who believed money, polish, and irritation could hold mortality at bay. Now all of that had burned away. Her fingers were locked around Lena's wrist with desperate strength, the tendons standing out beneath the hospital bracelet, and the voice that had once been edged with entitlement had collapsed into fear. She was no longer choosing her caregivers by instinctive social hierarchy or by the expensive habits of control she had spent a lifetime perfecting. She was pleading not to be left alone, and the plea was so nakedly human that it erased everything superficial about her in an instant. The emergency department at Harbor Point Medical Center was built of hard light, polished tile, and expensive neutrality. It was a place designed to appear calm even when bodies were failing at speed. But in that moment, trauma too felt smaller than a closet and tighter than breath. Monitors shrilled without rhythm. Wheels rattled over tile. A metal tray hit the floor and spun in a silver circle. Dr. Evan Voss, the most admired attending in the department whenever donors were near and the cruelest man in the room when they were not, snapped orders in every direction while still finding time to cut at the nurse he had spent 2 weeks calling invisible. He treated Lena's stillness as defiance. He told her to move if she was going to freeze. Lena did not move. She slipped one hand beneath the patient's shoulder blades and lifted just enough to relieve the pressure across the chest and back. With the other hand, she checked a pulse she had already sensed would be weaker on the left than on the right. Her eyes moved once to the monitor, once to the woman's face, and once to the syringe trembling in a resident's hand. Her voice came out level and almost quiet, but in that room quiet had more force than shouting. She said that no anticoagulants were to be given until the echo confirmed the diagnosis. Voss turned on her like a man publicly insulted. He insisted that she did not interrupt his bay. The woman on the gurney, fighting for air and no longer interested in titles, tried to force out the truth with her remaining breath. She wanted them to listen to Lena. That was the first moment the room changed. Fear has a smell to it, and pride has one too. Everyone in Trauma 2 could suddenly smell which one was winning. The hierarchy that had governed the room an hour earlier had begun to crack under the pressure of a body failing in real time and a nurse who refused to look away from what she knew. Then the double doors opened. A man in dark civilian clothes stepped in beside 2 naval corpsmen escorting another patient from the ambulance corridor. He was broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, and carried himself with the kind of stillness that made every hurried person nearby look theatrical. His gaze passed over residents, crash cart, donor family panic, and Voss's carefully cultivated command. Then it landed on Lena. He did not need to raise his voice. He only stared at the quiet nurse everyone had mocked all week, and under his breath he spoke a single name that seemed to carry distance and history with it. He called her Wren. No one in that room understood why Lena went perfectly still. No one understood why the commander's face tightened with disbelief and relief at once. No one, least of all Evan Voss, understood that the balance of power had shifted so completely it would never return to what it had been. 6 hours earlier, Lena had begun her shift the same way she began all of them, with a paper cup of coffee gone lukewarm before the first sip, and a silence she wore the way other people wore fragrance. Harbor Point Medical Center sat on the San Diego waterfront, 10 glassy floors facing the bay, rich enough to attract private donors and busy enough to insist it did not care about them. The emergency department was where image collided with panic. Valets impressed, jackets unloaded luxury sedans at one entrance while ambulances backed into another. And inside those walls, the distance between the wealthy and the desperate usually lasted only until triage. Lena had transferred in from a federal facility 3 months earlier. Her file described excellent trauma experience, exceptional field comm, and references that all repeated the same strange phrase about her being strong under irregular pressure. Large portions of her work history were redacted behind bureaucratic language and sealed attachments that Harbor Point's Human Resources Department had apparently decided were not worth pursuing so long as her license was current and her record was clean. To most people, that made her uninteresting. To Evan Voss, it made her useful. In his world, useful people did not require recognition. They required assignment. Lena got the midnight admissions, the combative intoxicated tourists, the supply audit. Nobody finished, and the families who needed a steady face after surgeons had delivered cold facts. She never complained. She charted on time. She noticed everything. Because she spoke only when necessary, people projected onto that silence whatever made them comfortable. Residents assumed she was shy. New nurses decided she was aloof. Monica Trent, the charge nurse who laughed too loudly at Voss's jokes and had built a career on being the right person's favorite, decided Lena was arrogant in the unforgivable, quiet way. Voss gave her a nickname by the second week. He called her the quiet nurse and liked to repeat it where others could hear. He joked that if they lowered the lights, she might disappear completely. The younger residents smirked into their coffee. Monica enjoyed herself. Lena never flinched, and that denied him the small pleasure he wanted most. Still, there were details about her that attentive people could not quite ignore. She never asked where emergency exits were. She already knew. When multiple alarms layered over each other, her eyes did not widen the way ordinary people's eyes did. They narrowed. She returned trauma shears to the same place with the same neat, economical motion every time, like muscle memory formed somewhere older than civilian nursing. She wore no jewelry except a plain, woven band on her right hand that looked too practical to be sentimental. One Tuesday, when a helicopter passed low over the bay and the windows hummed, Lena paused with her palm flat against a medication drawer, not frightened and not startled, but listening in a way that did not belong to ordinary hospital life. Then she went back to work as if nothing had happened. Monica noticed another detail and did not know what to do with it. Lena used language most hospital nurses did not use unless they had worked somewhere stranger than hospitals. She said 2 o'clock position instead of over there. She said secure airway instead of get respiratory. She said establish line instead of start an IV when urgency stripped politeness away. The first time a resident heard it, he laughed and joked about whether they were in an emergency room or on a submarine. Monica laughed too. Lena simply handed him the lab printout he had almost forgotten to sign. She lived in a small apartment in Point Loma above a dry cleaner and below a retired couple who played old jazz on Sunday mornings. She drove an aging gray hatchback with no stickers, no vanity plate, and an interior so clean it looked staged. Her neighbors knew she left before sunrise and came home long after dark. They knew she watered the unclaimed plant in the hallway. They knew she once carried an elderly man's groceries up 3 flights without being asked. They did not know why she sometimes sat in the parked car for 10 minutes before going upstairs, hands on the wheel looking at nothing visible. People often mistook privacy for emptiness. It almost never was. The afternoon the story turned, Harbor Point was in one of those deceptive lulls that emergency medicine learns never to trust. The waiting room held a surfer with a shoulder injury, a restaurant manager with a hand burn, an elderly man insisting chest pressure was probably indigestion, and a woman in a cream blazer who arrived with a driver, a leather handbag, and the expression of someone insulted by vulnerability. Her name was Catherine Bell. Her husband, Richard Bell, served as treasurer of Harbor Point's philanthropic board, which meant staff recognized the surname before they checked the pulse. Catherine was 52, elegant, composed, and angry before anyone had touched her because the valet had taken too long and triage smelled, in her opinion, too much like antiseptic and bad decisions. Monica saw the name and straightened instantly. Catherine pressed her fingertips against the center of her chest and complained of terrible pressure moving into her back. She reported nearly fainting in the car. Lena stepped forward with the intake tablet and introduced herself, ready to begin questions and vitals immediately. Catherine looked Lena over with a brief sorting glance, the kind of glance wealthy people sometimes learn without realizing they have learned it, and announced that she would prefer someone more experienced. Monica's mouth twitched with satisfaction. Lena explained that she could begin now while the attending was updated. Catherine turned to Monica instead and made a cutting remark about Lena looking as though she would apologize to a bandage before opening it. Monica laughed openly. The driver looked at the floor. Lena stood still for exactly 1 breath and then answered only that the sooner they started, the sooner they could rule out the dangerous causes. Catherine repeated that she wanted someone else. It was not the first refusal Lena had ever heard and not the worst. Patients refused care for all kinds of reasons, including fear, pain, class prejudice, vanity, and old stories. They carried into new rooms. Good nurses learned not to make every refusal personal, but Lena caught 3 things in the few seconds before Monica took over. Catherine rubbed the center of her sternum rather than the left side of her chest. Her voice held a slight rasp that did not match her posture. And when Monica cuffed blood pressure on the right arm, Catherine winced when the left sleeve brushed her shoulder blade. Lena quietly instructed Monica to check bilateral pressures. Monica rolled her eyes and demanded to know why. Lena answered only that she was asking her to. Monica stared, irritated into compliance largely because Catherine Bell was watching and took the second pressure. Her expression shifted. The right arm was markedly higher than the left. Voss entered with white coat open and smile prepared. He had one of those expensive, controlled voices that made frightened families feel they were in good hands and staff members feel smaller than they were. He greeted Catherine with polished confidence. She visibly relaxed at once. Status recognized status. She described chest pressure, back pain, and dizziness, minimizing the severity by calling it stress while making clear that her husband had insisted. Voss listened, asked his three polished questions, glanced at the monitor, and saw exactly what men like him always saw first. He saw elevated pressure. He saw a donor spouse. He saw anxiety. He preferred diagnoses that made him look fast. He suggested panic or reflux and promised a workup. From the counter, Lena said evenly that Catherine had unequal arm pressures. Voss thanked her in the particular tone that meant stop breathing near me. Lena added that the pain was central and radiating to the back and that there was hoarseness as well. Now he looked at her, not long, just enough to make the rebuke public. He asked whether she was presenting at rounds. When she said no, he told her not to. Two residents pretended not to hear. Monica suddenly found a supply drawer fascinating. Catherine watched the exchange and for the first time looked uncertain. Voss ordered labs, ECG, chest imaging, pain control, and observation. It was not completely wrong. It was only not urgent enough for what Lena feared. And what Lena feared was that a tear hidden inside a human body could outrun ego by only a few minutes. For the next 20 minutes, the department moved in the practiced chaos hospitals refer to as normal. Catherine complained about the blanket. Richard Bell arrived in a Navy suit already on the phone to administration. The surfer vomited from pain medication. A stroke alert rolled in. Respiratory therapy wheeled by with portable equipment. The silent television in the waiting area displayed a cooking show while real lives changed direction 30 feet away. Lena moved from room to room without hurry and without waste. She started a line on the stroke patient in one attempt while reassuring his daughter. She replaced a malfunctioning pump before anyone had to ask. She read Catherine Bell's ECG over Monica's shoulder and looked again because it did not fit the easy story. It was not a classic heart attack. It showed nonspecific changes, nothing dramatic enough to satisfy a doctor addicted to obviousness. When Catherine asked for ice water and Monica stepped away, Lena entered the room to fix a monitor lead dropping signal. Catherine sharpened immediately and reminded her that someone else had been requested. Lena answered that she was only fixing telemetry, then observed that the pain was worse. Catherine started to deny it and stopped because denial had become harder than honesty. She admitted the pain had moved between her shoulders. Lena asked about voice change and swallowing. Catherine wanted to know why. Lena asked again, and something in the tone made Catherine answer. Swallowing felt strange. Lena then told her with soft precision that if anything changed suddenly, she was to call before trying to stand. Catherine gave a brittle laugh and suggested Lena talked as though they were under attack. Lena answered only that bodies could feel that way. At the charting station, Voss was already discussing bed turnover, transfer pressure, and the possibility of moving Catherine upstairs if initial labs were clean. Lena set the monitor strip beside his coffee and told him the rate was trending irregular. He said to document it. She said she was. Then she said Catherine needed an urgent scan. Voss looked up and asked on what basis. Lena listed the presentation, bilateral pressure difference, pain pattern, new hoarseness, and assessment findings. He interrupted to reduce it all to intuition, the favorite word of men who wanted expertise to sound feminine and therefore dismissible. Lena corrected him. It was assessment. One resident smirked without meaning to. Another looked ashamed. Monica folded discharge papers with exaggerated concentration. Voss announced that they were not going to transform every anxious, wealthy woman with chest pain into a television diagnosis because the nurse was bored on a Wednesday. Lena said nothing. He interpreted silence as triumph and asked if there was anything else. She answered yes and said that if Catherine deteriorated, they were not to start heparin before imaging. The station fell so quiet that the printer in the corner sounded violent. Voss laughed and called the warning adorable. Lena answered that it was not. Then he sent her to medicate another patient. At 4:18 in the afternoon, Catherine Bell decided she was tired of waiting. The choice was small, stubborn, and expensive-looking. The sort of movement wealthy people make when trying to prove discomfort is merely a scheduling problem. Richard was on the phone at the foot of the bed using phrases like unacceptable and donor relations. Monica was chasing a warmer blanket. Catherine swung her legs off the stretcher. and the room tilted. She grabbed for the side rail, missed, and would have hit the floor if Lena had not been passing the doorway at exactly that second. Lena caught her under the arms and knew immediately that the situation had turned. There was cold sweat, abrupt weakness, and panic no longer rooted in irritation but in biology. Catherine's eyes went wide with the horror of losing control inside her own skin. Lena told her to stay with her and asked for the chest pain score, then the back pain, then the breathing. Catherine could not get enough air to finish a sentence. Lena hit the emergency bell. Everything accelerated. Monica rushed in annoyed until she saw Catherine's color. Voss arrived 3 steps behind. The monitor alarm sharpened. A resident brought the portable ultrasound. Respiratory called for access. Richard Bell was pushed gently but firmly toward the door and objected to the concept of being moved at all. Catherine found Lena's hand again. All the hauteur had washed off her face. Only fear remained. She begged for help. Lena squeezed once and told her she was there. Voss moved in with clipped command and declared a possible pulmonary embolism, preparing anticoagulation. Lena refused instantly. He demanded an explanation. She gave one in blunt clinical form: pulse deficit, tearing pain. If this was a dissection, anticoagulation could kill her. He accused her of undermining him in front of the patient. The resident holding the syringe froze, not from ignorance but from terror of choosing the wrong superior. Lena did not wait for permission. She wrapped a cuff around Catherine's other arm herself. One pressure dropped lower than before. She listened to the chest, touched Catherine's neck, assessed the pattern, and looked straight at Voss with the kind of focus that demanded either obedience or open cowardice. She ordered bedside echo, a call to CT surgery, the crash cart, and no heparin. Voss snarled that she was a nurse. Lena agreed. He told her to act like one. She answered that she was. That was the second time the room changed, because everyone present could tell the difference between someone defending authority and someone defending a life. The resident looked from Voss to Lena to the patient and did not depress the syringe. Catherine's blood pressure dropped again. Her breathing thinned. Voss swore and grabbed the ultrasound himself, perhaps to salvage ownership, perhaps because denial had finally become impossible. The image flickered into place, grainy and pale. There was fluid where no fluid belonged and pressure where no pressure should have been. One look was enough. Voss's posture changed as fast as bad certainty always does when reality arrives. He barked for surgery. Lena told him they had already been paged. He demanded to know by whom. She said she had done it 2 minutes earlier. Catherine made a small torn sound as Richard shouted from the doorway for someone to explain what was happening. Lena stayed focused on the patient and anchored her with the minimum truth required to keep panic from overwhelming physiology. Catherine needed to stay still. They knew what direction this was going. They were moving now. Surgery arrived with the special speed reserved for phrases like pericardial compromise and possible dissection. A cardiothoracic fellow entered already gloved and took one look at echo pressures and the patient. He asked who had called it. No one answered quickly enough. Lena, adjusting oxygen, said that she had. He looked at Voss. Voss claimed they had been assessing multiple causes. The fellow's jaw tightened, but he did not waste time on politics. He ordered the operating room immediately. The next 6 minutes moved like a practice storm. Lines were secured. Consent was dragged from a shaking husband. Blood was prepared. The transport route was cleared. A resident almost hung the anticoagulant anyway through habit, and Lena caught the tubing before it connected. Catherine had turned pale and young-looking in fear. As the bed moved toward the corridor, she froze. Lena's face through the blur of ceiling lights and understood the humiliating truth that the person she had dismissed first was the one standing between her and catastrophe. Lena went with the gurney as far as she could and let surgery swallow the patient, the team, and the donor family panic in a single sweep. The emergency department exhaled, and for 3 seconds nobody spoke. Then a resident said aloud what everyone had been thinking. Lena had called it, not only eventually but early. Voss snapped off his gloves with a violence that belonged entirely to embarrassment and ordered everyone back to work. But the hierarchy had already begun to dissolve. There is no faster acid for manufactured superiority than a public mistake prevented by the quiet person in the room. Lena returned to the charting station, sanitized her hands, and documented everything in precise, emotionless language. Initial presentation, reported symptoms, bilateral blood pressure discrepancy. Escalation to the attending, change in patient condition, actions taken, medication withheld pending imaging, surgical response, no adjectives, no revenge, no flourish. That kind of documentation frightens the wrong people far more than shouting ever could. At 4:41, while Catherine was being wheeled into surgery upstairs, Richard Bell stormed back down with an administrator on speakerphone and the face of a man disguising fear as rage. He demanded to know who was responsible for the delay. Voss stepped forward before anyone else could answer and claimed they had acted the moment Catherine's condition changed. Richard countered that his wife had nearly died in their emergency room. Voss insisted she had been stabilized and moved appropriately. Then Richard's gaze landed on Lena. He blamed her. The entire desk went still. He said she had been arguing with the physician in front of his wife. Voss did not correct him. Lena answered only that she had been advocating for Catherine. Richard accused her of alarming the patient and making her uncomfortable. Voss finally intervened, but not to defend Lena. Instead, he suggested they move the conversation away from the station. Too late. Registration had heard. Residents had heard. The paramedic finishing paperwork had heard. Lena stood in the middle of it without flinching, while Voss used the language of vague accusation and told the administrator there had been a nurse exceeding communication boundaries during a high-stress event. The speed of the betrayal almost surprised even Lena. She could have defended herself then. She could have described the warnings, the timestamps, the pressure readings, the syringe she had stopped, the fellow who had asked who called surgery. She did not. There are moments when defending yourself in the wrong room only improves cowardice's audience. Instead, she returned to her chart and finished the line she had been writing before interruption. The residents looked stricken. Monica looked baffled by such calm. Voss mistook composure for helplessness, as men like him often do just before consequences arrive. 20 minutes later, after Catherine's surgery had begun and the adrenaline had thinned, Voss called Lena into the glass-walled consult room near triage. Monica came too, because witnesses become protection when the truth is dirty. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and dry erase marker. Through the glass, Lena could see the desk and the residents pretending not to watch. Voss shut the door and stripped away the policy language quickly. He told her she had embarrassed him. There it was, cleaner than any formal complaint. Lena answered that the patient had survived. He reframed the entire event as a team correcting a complex case. Lena named surgery as the real correction. He warned her not to get clever. She said she was not. Monica added that Lena had made the whole department look chaotic in front of a donor family. Lena replied that the department had been chaotic because the patient was unstable. Voss placed a form on the table and relieved her from trauma assignments pending administrative review. The document listed failure to follow chain of command, unprofessional communication in the presence of family, and potential medication interference. That last phrase was almost artful in its dishonesty. He had transformed the act that likely saved Catherine Bell's life into a sentence that sounded dangerous on paper. Lena asked whether he was truly writing her up for stopping the wrong medication from reaching the patient. He said he was only documenting an event and implied that if she believed she was right, she should welcome review. She asked whether he had charted that she raised concern before deterioration. He said that was not the issue. She answered that it would be. That small certainty unsettled him more than resistance would have. He told her to float to observation and keep her head down while they sorted out her hero complex later. The phrase land. D poorly because Lena looked nothing like someone hungry for credit. She only looked tired in the ancient way people look when they have seen the same arrogance in danger lives in more than one uniform. She folded the paper, placed it in her scrub pocket, and returned to work. By 5:30, half the floor had heard some version of the story. The quiet nurse had overstepped. The quiet nurse had called a rare diagnosis. The quiet nurse had nearly harmed a donor. The quiet nurse had saved a donor. The quiet nurse had been put in her place. All the versions circulated at once because truth without leadership quickly becomes rumor. Lena helped an elderly widower understand new medications and wrote instructions in larger print because his glasses were broken. She sat beside a woman with severe vertigo and kept one hand lightly on the rail until the spinning passed. In the supply room, Monica said loudly to another nurse that some people confused being calm with being correct. Lena heard and kept counting saline flushes. At 6:02, the cardiothoracic fellow came back down after surgery, hair cap removed, expression still sharpened by urgency. He stopped at the desk and asked which nurse had paged them. Monica answered too quickly that the team had escalated together. He repeated the question. Silence followed. Lena was restocking dressings at the far cabinet. He spotted her, nodded once, and crossed to her. He told her it had been a good catch. Lena asked only how Catherine was doing. He answered that she was alive because the tear had not fully ruptured before bypass, and that 2 more minutes would have changed the conversation entirely. Then he left. Monica went pale with anger because public praise is hardest to endure when you helped bury the person who earned it. Voss emerged in time to see enough of the exchange to recognize what was happening. Respect had pointed itself in the wrong direction, so he escalated. At 6:17, Lena's badge access to Trauma 1 and Trauma 2 was revoked for the remainder of the shift. She discovered it when the reader flashed red instead of green. A younger nurse murmured dismay before catching herself. Lena tried once more, not because she expected a different result, but because facts deserved confirmation. Red again. Voss's voice came from behind her, reminding her that she was observation only. She turned and asked if he had disabled her access. He replied that she was under review. She asked whether the review was for being right in public. He answered that it was for insubordination. The hallway between the trauma bays was narrow and busy, too public for privacy and too exposed for intervention. Voss liked spaces where intimidation could masquerade as management. He asked whether one lucky guess made her believe she was indispensable. She answered no. He said her problem was that she carried herself as though she were above proving herself. She told him she proved herself every shift. He said perhaps to patients, but not to him. There it was again, not policy, but personal offense dressed as authority. Lena looked at him and answered that it sounded like his problem. The silence afterward had edges. He warned her to be very careful. She replied that she was and walked past him. Fear had refused him twice in one day. At 6:40, administration requested Lena remain on site after shift for incident review. At 6:52, Richard Bell called the chief operations officer. At 7:03, Catherine Bell's surgery ended successfully, though she remained guarded in post-operative care. At 7:10, the emergency department got another ambulance alert, then another, then a direct line from the naval liaison desk near the helipad. Monica answered first. Her posture shifted before she had spoken 3 words. Voss took the phone, listened for 12 seconds, and lost some color. There had been a training incident off Coronado. 2 patients were inbound, 1 serious, and military liaison would be involved. The atmosphere changed instantly because institutions that adore donors also adore uniforms, provided the uniforms arrive attached to prestige. Resuscitation was prepared. Trauma access needed overriding because Lena's badge was still revoked. Someone hesitated and pointed out they were short. Voss ordered them to leave the lock as it was. Thus, the most trauma-capable nurse on the floor was deliberately kept outside the bay while incoming military trauma rolled in. That choice would matter, too. The first patient was a young naval operator with blunt chest injury and respiratory distress after a fast-rope training malfunction. The second was stable but concussed. Their escort entered behind them, not in dress uniform or ceremony, but in dark slacks and a plain shirt, carrying authority that did not require decoration. Commander Gabriel Rourke had a face carved more by patience than anger. He asked no dramatic questions. He gave the receiving team the exact mechanism of injury, the time of incident, the interventions already performed, and the note that the injured operator's baseline conditioning was elite enough that visible distress meant more than it would in the average patient. Voss greeted him with the eager professionalism of a man recognizing potential institutional value. Rourke answered with a single nod and kept his attention on the patient. As the gurney turned toward Trauma 1, the automatic door flashed red. A corpsman frowned and tried again. Red. Monica rushed over and manually overrode the lock. Rourke noticed. Men like him always notice friction because friction precedes failure. Inside Trauma 1, the room filled quickly. The injured operator was conscious but fading. Respiratory effort was shallow. There was bruising across the chest, a pulse climbing in the wrong direction, and monitor alarms not yet catastrophic but trending toward it. Lena, in Observation 9, heard the particular cadence of military medevac reporting through the hall door before she consciously processed the words. It was the rhythm first. She handed off her current patient, washed her hands, and stepped into the corridor. At the trauma doors, she stopped at the glowing red light. Through the small pane, she could only see fragments of movement, Voss to the left. A resident uncertain at the airway, a nurse reaching for equipment 2 beats too late. Then came the verbal assessments from inside. Diminished breath sounds on the right, pressure drifting, a suggestion to wait for imaging. Lena closed her eyes for half a second. It was too slow. A young tech saw her at the door and started to explain the badge issue. Lena said she already knew. From inside, the operator coughed painfully and tried to lift a hand. The corpsman near the door glanced through the glass, saw Lena, and did a tiny involuntary double take he could not explain. Perhaps it was the posture. Perhaps some forms of readiness looked the same no matter the setting. Then Rourke turned from the foot of the bed and saw her. He did not react theatrically. He only looked once, then again more sharply, as though memory had grabbed him by the collar. He crossed to the door and opened it manually. Monica began protesting about sterile process. He ignored her. He looked at Lena and called her Wren. The name hit the air like a switch thrown in darkness. Lena lost what little color she had left. Behind Rourke, Voss frowned in open confusion. Rourke did not bother explaining. He told them to open the bay. Voss tried to object that Lena was not assigned. Rourke's gaze moved sideways and Voss stopped talking mid-sentence. There are looks built from years of command, and people who depend on title rather than character recognize instantly when their own authority is made of cardboard. Lena stepped inside. The injured operator looked barely old enough to wear the exhaustion he carried. Through pain and oxygen deprivation, he focused on Lena and managed the beginnings of recognition, calling her ma'am with weak confusion. Her voice changed slightly when she answered. Not warmer, but sharper. She assessed him in 3 seconds. Chest rise, trachea, neck veins, skin, pulse, monitor, mechanism. She looked at the corpsman's field dressing and then at the resident holding the ultrasound probe like a student in the wrong orchestra. She said tension was building on the right and that it was happening now. Voss reflexively resisted. He said they were imaging. She answered that they were losing time. The patient's oxygen saturation dipped as if agreeing. Rourke watched without blinking. The resident looked at Voss. Lena did not. She looked straight at the resident and told him to say what he saw. He swallowed, checked the screen, and finally admitted that lung sliding was absent on the right. Voss cursed and ordered decompression. Too late to own it cleanly, too early to bury it. The resident moved. Air released, pressure eased. The monitor steadied by increments. The patient took a deeper breath and clutched the sheet like a man stepping back from a cliff edge. There was no theatrical miracle, only the relief that exposes exactly how near disaster had been. Rourke never took his eyes off Lena, not while Voss tried to reclaim command, not while Monica suddenly found everyone's gaze unbearable. Not while the corpsman at the wall stared at Lena with dawning recognition, as if an old story had stepped into fluorescent light. One resident whispered the question no one else had dared yet. He wanted to know who Wren was. No one answered. Not then. The operator stabilized enough for imaging. The second patient was sent to monitored care. The bay emptied in layers until only essential staff remained. Near the sink, Rourke stepped aside with Voss. Lena stripped off gloves, movements neat and expression closed again. Voss forced a smile and said he was glad they could support. Rourke asked which nurse had made the call on Catherine Bell earlier. The question landed like a dropped scalpel. Voss pretend. Dead confusion. Rourke clarified by referring to the board treasurer's wife and remarking that Harbor Point staff was not especially good at whispering. Monica opened her mouth and shut it. Voss tried to broaden the answer into team response and collaboration. Rourke nodded as if filing it away and repeated the question. Which nurse? That was all. No raised voice, no threat, just refusal to let language blur facts. Finally, Voss admitted that Nurse Vale had voiced concern. Rourke asked whether that had happened before or after deterioration. Voss hesitated a fraction too long. Then Rourke turned to Lena and asked the same. She said before. He asked whether it had been documented. She said yes. He asked about witnesses. She said yes. Rourke gave the smallest nod. Monica tried to reclaim control by assuring him the matter was under internal review. Rourke accepted that with a single quiet word and then drove the blade deeper. He observed that if the woman who had just saved their donor's wife and identified his operator's chest complication was under review, then he was very interested in the quality of that review. No one moved. Some truths do not get louder. They get heavier. Voss said clinical administration was not a military matter. Rourke answered that competence was. Then he looked at Lena with that strange mix of recognition and protectiveness that had nothing to do with patronizing rescue and everything to do with a man finding a decorated standard being used as a cleaning rag. He said he had not expected to see her in a civilian trauma bay. Lena answered that she had hoped not to be recognized in one. That exchange confirmed to everyone listening that they knew each other from a world much larger than Harbor Point's petty politics. Rourke asked who the highest-ranking administrative officer on site was. Monica identified the night nursing supervisor and the assistant medical director. He told her to call them. She asked why. His eyes cooled, and he answered that he had just watched a nurse with revoked trauma access outperform the room twice and wanted to know whether that had happened by accident or by design. Monica did not argue again. The night supervisor arrived first. Denise Quan had been at Harbor Point long enough to outlast executives, medical directors, and one attempted merger. Her calm alone could stop panic from spreading. She looked at the faces outside Trauma 1 and knew the shift had already broken in a meaningful way. She told them to talk. Voss began, and that was his next mistake. Used the language of risk management too early, speaking of communication issues, role clarity, and challenging behavior under stress. He was coherent, polished, and persuasive in the abstract, exactly the kind of man institutions reward until someone bleeds. Denise listened without interruption, then turned to Lena and asked for her version. Lena gave it in under 2 minutes. No embroidery, no dragged names, just the sequence. Assessment, warning, deterioration, medication withheld. Surgical escalation, badge access revoked. Denise asked whether Lena had charted before the outcome was known. Yes, time stamp. Lena supplied them without hesitation. Denise then asked Voss who had authorized access revocation. He said he had. Denise repeated the question in a form that made clear she had heard the answer and found it wanting. Had he revoked a trauma-capable nurse during incoming military trauma without supervisory approval? His justification was that Lena had been disruptive. Denise did not react outwardly, but the air around her went colder. The assistant medical director arrived next. Risk management joined by video. Incredibly, Richard Bell appeared again from upstairs because privileged men have a habit of materializing where the most damage can be done. He entered ready to advocate against the nurse from earlier. Denise stopped him before he could gather momentum. She said his wife was out of surgery and stable, and that if he was present for patient safety, he could sit, but if he was there to influence staffing, he could leave. It slowed him just enough. Rourke remained near the wall, not posturing, not intervening beyond necessity, which made his presence more powerful rather than less. He was not there to rescue Lena theatrically. He was there to insist that truth remain intact. Denise requested the chart, monitor logs, medication pull history, badge access records, and order timing. Hospitals are forever building quiet little machines that remember what people later hope to rewrite. The records appeared. At 4:23, Lena had charted concern for vascular emergency and pressure discrepancy. At 4:24, she documented direct verbal notification to the attending. At 4:31, she charted worsening pain pattern and hoarseness. At 4:34, anticoagulant had been pulled by a resident but never administered. At 4:35, the surgical page had originated from Lena's station login. At 4:37, Voss entered his first note. Denny. See, let silence settle over that sequence. Richard Bell looked confused first, then embarrassed, then defensive. He said his wife had described conflict around her care. Lena answered before anyone else could weaponize the phrasing. There had not been conflict around care, only urgency around care. Risk management requested witness statements from staff present. One resident spoke before Voss could arrange the room with his expression. He said Nurse Vale had raised concern before the decline. Another added that she had stopped the heparin. Monica tried to hide behind chaos. Denise cut directly through that refuge and asked the one question that mattered. Was Lena wrong? Monica's mouth opened and closed, and at last she said no. It was the first honest contribution she had made all evening. Then Denise's phone buzzed, and because secrecy had become useless, she answered on speaker. A weak but clear voice from upstairs asked whether Lena was there. It was Catherine Bell. Denise confirmed that she was. Catherine said she wanted it on record that the nurse had warned them that she herself had refused Lena's help and that she had been wrong. Richard Bell told his wife she should be resting. Catherine answered with the strange authority of the newly humbled. She said she remembered exactly who had stayed calm when she herself was afraid. She made clear that if anyone was in trouble because of what had happened that day, it was not to be Lena. When the call ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Nothing destroys a false narrative faster than the central witness refusing to support it. Denise folded her arms and stated that they were no longer discussing personality, only conduct. She asked Voss why Lena had been written up before chart review. He produced nothing useful. She asked why trauma access had been revoked based solely on his word in midshift. He said Lena had challenged an attending in front of a patient. Denise answered by reframing it correctly. She had correctly identified a life-threatening emergency. Voss retreated to his last refuge and said it had undermined confidence. Rourke finally spoke very quietly and asked in whom. That question broke something invisible in the room. Because once framed that way, the answer became unbearable. Not confidence in care, not confidence in process. Confidence in Voss, his image, his control, his need to remain the smartest man standing even when a patient could not afford his pride. Denise made the decision institutional adults make when they are tired of watching insecurity wear professional authority. Effective immediately, she removed Voss from patient-facing decision-making pending formal review. Monica was to remain on shift under supervisory observation. Lena's trauma access was restored. Voss stared at her in disbelief and accused her of suspending him based on a donor complaint and one military officer's opinion. Denise answered that she was removing him based on documentation, witness corroboration, and his own timing. Then Rourke straightened from the wall and said there was something else they should know. He looked at Lena first, giving her one brief chance to stop him. She did not. She also did not encourage him, and that restraint told Denise more than speech would have. Rourke said that some of them knew her as Lena Vale, some as the nurse who had kept their donor alive and caught his operator's collapse, but long before Harbor Point, she had served with Naval Special Warfare Medical Support. Her call sign had been Wren. The word widened inside the room now that it had context. Rourke did not dramatize it. He said that if they had never heard the name, it was because most of the work attached to it had never been meant for public applause. But within the communities that owed people their lives, some names did not disappear. He described an operation off the Horn of Africa where an extraction failed, communications degraded, and casualty numbers changed by the minute. Lena had triaged 6 wounded men in darkness, with incoming fire close enough to kill exterior lighting on the deck. She had made decisions no one should have had to make at that age, and because those decisions were correct, 11 people had gone home who were not expected to. He described another mission where a coastal evacuation collapsed during a storm and civilians flooded the aftermath. No cameras, no press, no ceremonial medals on television. Lena had kept children breathing, stabilized fractures, improvised transport routes, and never once asked who would receive credit. He said there were still training modules in 2 programs built around decisions she had made, not her name, only the calls, because the calls were that good. Then he looked directly at Voss and said that finding her locked out of trauma had felt personal. The room did not shift into all alone, it shifted into shame. Mockery becomes different the moment you realize exactly how unearned it was. Monica covered her mouth before she could stop herself. A younger nurse whispered an oath under her breath. The residents looked at Lena not with simple admiration, but with the painful self-awareness of people realizing they had laughed in the wrong direction. Lena finally spoke, and the first thing she said made clear why she had never told any of them herself. She said it had been a long time ago. Rourke answered that it was not a long time ago to the people still alive because of it. Denise, careful and quiet now, asked why none of it had been in her file. Lena said that parts of her previous service had been redacted for reasons that were not hers to advertise, and that she had not come to Harbor Point to be impressive. She had come to work. She said the hospital had hired a licensed trauma nurse, and that should have been enough. The room fell silent again because the answer was so simple and so devastating. It should have been enough. She did not say that she had spent years in places where bragging got people killed, and where competence mattered only if it kept someone breathing until dawn. She did not say that the instinct to stay small had followed her home from every place the Home Office had blacked out on paper. She did not explain that in some environments being underestimated is safer than being known. None of that was necessary. Her posture said enough. The life behind the redactions had not vanished. It had simply gone quiet. Denise looked at the room as if seeing it stripped bare. One doctor had gambled with a life to preserve status. One charge nurse had mistaken social usefulness for leadership. A donor husband had tried to bend truth with influence. A department full of intelligent people had watched a competent woman be underestimated because she did not market herself, and most had allowed it until crisis made silence impossible. The problem was larger than Evan Voss, though he was the clearest symptom. It was the oldest institutional failure there was, the habit of confusing confidence with volume and competence with permission. Lena did not ask for apology. That unsettled them almost more than the revelation. She did not posture, correct the record beyond what facts required, or stand taller because now they finally had a story large enough to attach to her name. She looked tired, restored her badge to the pocket where it belonged, and asked whether there was a patient assignment for her. Denise stared at her for a moment with something close to respect, then answered yes. There always was. Harbor Point still had a full emergency department, and midnight was coming whether their egos recovered or not. By the time Lena walked back toward Trauma 2, the corridor felt different. The same lights glared overhead, the same printers clicked, the same antiseptic air moved through vents, but the people in that hallway were no longer seeing the same woman they had seen at dawn. They were seeing the cost of their own assumptions. The quiet nurse had never been empty space. She had never been timid. She had never needed Evan Voss's approval to become what she already was. She had simply been working in a room too small to recognize her. The balance of power did not shift back. It could not. Too many facts had gone on record. Too many witnesses had heard the same sequence and seen the same restraint. Catherine Bell was alive upstairs because Lena had listened when everyone else was still sorting class and confidence into categories. A naval operator was breathing more easily because Lena had recognized a life-threatening pattern through a locked door. A commander had crossed years of silence and called her by the name attached to work no one in Harbor Point had been important enough to know. And the institution, for one sharp evening, had been forced to watch the difference between performance and competence in fluorescent light. When Lena stepped into trauma again, no one joked about lowered lights or vanishing. No one called her the quiet nurse like it was a diminishment. The younger resident who had once laughed at her phrasing stepped aside before she reached the supply cabinet. Monica did not meet her eyes. Voss was gone from the bay, suspended into administrative limbo where polished language could not protect him for at least one night. The machines kept sounding their ordinary alarms. Stretchers kept rolling. New patients kept arriving with fresh pain, fresh blood, fresh fear. The work had not changed, only the room had. That was always the truth beneath everything else. Real competence does not arrive in a blaze and demand to be admired. It waits, observes, assesses, and acts when the cost of delay becomes unacceptable. It does not always explain itself to people who have not earned the explanation. Sometimes it spends months being mistaken for silence. Sometimes it allows mediocre men to mock it because the work matters more than the ego bruises. And then one day a life hangs in the balance, and the person everyone underestimated becomes the axis around which the whole room turns. Long after the shift would end, people at Harbor Point would remember the details differently. Some would remember Catherine Bell's hand locked around Lena's wrist. Some would remember the echo image that changed Voss's face. Some would remember the red badge light at the trauma door. Some would remember the slow weight of Rourke's question about whose confidence had truly been undermined. Some would remember the name Wren and the way it moved through the room like a current. But the deepest thing they would remember was simpler. The quiet one had never been powerless. They had only been too loud to notice.